I think everyone here knows who I am, but I'm Nate Ward. I'm the director of the Global Business Center at Cleveland State University. I'm also the regional director for the Export Assistance Network with the Ohio Small Business Development Centers. I'm joined here by my colleague, Then Bowie, who has been the main person putting on the show. Thanks very much, Then. So just very briefly, what our office does in general is working for the Small Business Development Centers. We are basically taxpayer-funded business advisors to help small to medium-sized companies in our state do more, to be as robust as they can, to be as strategic as they can, to be as efficient, and obviously to thrive. Excuse me. And of course, we all know this year our worlds were turned upside down, and for many of the companies who had received PPP loans or the Economic Injury Disaster Relief Loan through the SBA, that was all part of the CARES Act funding. But there was also a portion of the CARES Act funding that went to economic development cooperators. And our Small Business Development Center was the recipient of CARES Act funding. And what we did with that was we've turned it around and we've hired a number of specialized consultants who we are basically hiring and we are putting out there for businesses to be able to use. And we're basically leasing them out to companies, if you will. So Mollie Katz, who's going to be our featured speaker here for part 3 of our 4-part series on leading remote teams virtually, has been a real find for us. We had not worked with Mollie previously, but she has a long tenured career working with Lubrizol, who everyone in this region knows who Lubrizol is. I'll explain a little bit more about Mollie in just a minute, but I'll point you to our website here in case you hadn't seen it before. I'll post it in the chat. But csusbdc.com, this is where you could find all of our COVID relief information, including our CARES Act consultants. So just briefly, I want to share with you where you could find the information about the frequently asked questions, the companies that meet the qualifications and so forth. But if you read here, essentially what we're promoting is that if your company would like to engage Mollie services, for example, or any of our other CARES Act consultants, you can do so, and our center will pick up the bill for their work. If you'd like for Mollie to do individualized training for your company, for your staff, whomever it is, that's exactly what this program is designed for. Actually, she's meeting with one of our clients on Tuesday next week to discuss an employee handbook, for example. This is actually not the complete updated list. We sort of, this is a program that's, we have over a year to go through all the funding. So if any point from now until September you have an interest, so here's Mollie's information by the, so she also recorded a webinar for us a few months back. But for example, if you look at, this is our financial expert, she also does taxes. This has been a real popular program. And again, this is all part of the CARES Act. So we are offering these services for no charge to eligible Ohio companies. And just really briefly, what does eligibility mean? It means your company needs to be based in Ohio. You need to qualify as a small to medium-sized business according to the SBA business size standards. And we're also asking this service to be reserved just for companies that have already made a sale. So if your company fits that description, we'd love to connect you with any of our consultants. It's been a real popular program. Beyond that, our regular services, we offer free and confidential consulting to businesses of all different types. So with that, I won't take up any more of your time, but to pass over to Mollie, I really just want to commend Mollie. This is the 3rd part of a 4-part series. The last one wraps up tomorrow at the same time, same place. But if you've missed the recordings from last week, we sent those out and they're all being published to our website at CSU. You can find them at csuohio.edu/global/global. I don't know why there's 2 globals, but we're really that global, I guess. And we also have the link to them at the csusbdc.com website. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Mollie. Thank you so much, Mollie, for all your work. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to your presentation today.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nate. I'm going to share my screen and then tell you what we'll be doing today. Okay, hopefully you're seeing my screen. Okay, so as Nate mentioned, I've been doing these webinars, and Dan is a repeat visitor on these around leading a remote team. It's a 4-part series, but I also designed it so each one can kind of be a standalone. I see everybody's muting their mics, but That's okay, but I really like you to participate today, especially because this is about leading a remote team. And I could stand here and talk at you till 10 o'clock, but I think you'll get more out of it if you participate. And people who watch the video in the future will get more out of it if you participate as well. So I'll let you introduce yourselves in just a minute. But just to tell you what we're going to do today, this is part 3 of the webinar series. It's going to talk about engagement, commitment on your remote team, how you can make good decisions on a remote team, which can be sometimes a challenge. So we'll talk about team norms, motivation, commitment, accountability, and agile decision making. So how this fits in with the overall picture of what we're doing in this program is the first session was about forming your remote team, and we talked about remote recruiting and onboarding. The second one we did last week was around trust and healthy conflict and making sure your team is in a good place to manage conflicts that can happen, the ones you know about and the ones you don't know about on your team that can happen when you're remote. This one is about commitment and engagement. And tomorrow we'll talk about something, everyone's favorite topic is performance reviews. And they're challenging enough when you're all in the same room together, but it's even more challenging when you're not co-located, particularly if you haven't been co-located over the year and you've got to talk about things that maybe you never really had built up to. You hadn't set expectations. So we'll talk about that. And one of the things, and this has been built on Patrick Lencioni's model of an effective team, is you have to first have trust. You have to know how to deal with conflict. What comes out of conflict is sometimes it's interpersonal conflict, and sometimes it's we have different ways of doing things. And what happens with that is once you come out of that is being able to say, we need to have some norms, how we're all going to work together effectively. And what norms are basically is a set of agreements on how team members are going to work effectively together. This is extra important when you're on a remote team, because even as you were talking about it, meetings, how do you conduct meetings? How do you make sure you're getting out of that meeting what you need to have? How are you making sure that you're making good use of time? How are you aligning people with your culture? And you can have norms at a very simple level, and you can have norms that are very complex. And we'll talk about what that looks like. Like even at home, we have certain norms. I like to cook. So I cook dinner and I make sure we have a good dinner. I make sure as I'm cooking, I put the dishes in the dishwasher. That's one of our agreements. But the other part of it is I don't like to clean up. So my husband and son are the ones that clean the kitchen, and they make sure that the kitchen looks as spotless as it did before I started cooking. So it's an agreement that we have, and it makes dinner time a lot less stressful than it could be if it was kind of a free-for-all. And that was something we worked out over time in what that would look like. Your team is going to also need to have norms as you go through the process of becoming a highly effective team. And so what we're going to talk about are some different ways that that comes into play, because that helps build the commitment, that helps build motivation, that helps build a high functioning team. Team norms help you avoid politics and disagreements, because norms are agreed upon ways of working. It helps avoid conflict because everybody is determined this is how we're going to do things. It gives people a sense of ownership because it gives them a structure that they can work within. And it kind of minimizes some of those challenges of working on a remote team. Over the course of the first 2 sessions in this program, we talked about there's a lot of pros and cons on a work team. And today, I hope that you'll join in and tell me what some of those are as we go through this, because I really want to make this fit some of the things that you're dealing with. And norms of behavior on a team can really help you focus on how we're going to interact effectively. On a remote team, that's absolutely essential because you're not seeing each other every day. You don't get to build that relationship every day. You're doing it in a more sterile environment and a more artificial environment. So when you think about the types of norms that teams tend to develop, they tend to be around different things, how we're going to communicate. And so it could be that we do it, the ways that we communicate, how often we communicate. It could be around how we coordinate things, what our processes are, where the handoffs are. It could be around where people are, the process that people need to make decisions. And then there are norms of behavior around the culture. This is how we interact. This is the expectation for how we deal with conflict and how we deal with each other and how we interact with each other and how often we talk about different things. Norms are basically, they're foundational, they're things you agree upon. They could deal with how you're accountable to each other, ways of working. They could have to do with how you deal with conflict, for example. So last time we talked a lot about conflict and where conflicts can happen on a remote team and what you could do about them. And some of the norms that teams might talk about is when you're upset with somebody, instead of talking about it with other people, you talk directly to that person. That when you do talk about conflict, you do it in a way that isn't accusatory. You do it in a way that's, you know, this is what happened, this is the result, this is what we need to do about it. It could be about how you innovate, how you handle feedback. That feedback is expected on our team, that we will give each other feedback at the end of meetings. So a lot of really successful teams think about these different aspects of how they come together and where it makes sense to have those rules of engagement. There's a lot of norms that are around processes, who owns different things. One of the things that we'll talk about today as part of motivation and engagement is being very clear about establishing ownership of a process, how you communicate with stakeholders, how you involve others in decision making, how you use technology, how you define team roles. And then also, and I think Howard, hopefully you'll find this one we'll be talking about in just a moment, about meetings. Because one of the things we discussed last time is when this whole thing started back in March with COVID and everyone started working remotely, there was kind of this spirit of, let's all make it work. Let's get in, you know, the adrenaline was pumping, the meetings, you know, we're all figuring out Zoom and we were all so excited because we learned how to share our screens and everything. And it was great. People just jumped in and did it. But that's kind of worn off and people are feeling less engaged and it's not as exciting to be on Zoom and it's not as exciting to show. Yeah, and see, that's the thing. And what we talked about last time is conflict it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Teams are going to have conflict, whether it's you know, and you don't have to tell us what yours was and I'll kind of take us down a rabbit hole, but if, you know, teams are going to have conflict, whether it's an interpersonal thing, a disagreement or whatever, or it could be, I think we need to do this, or we need to change that. And people are going to have differences of opinions. And it's important for a team to be successful. And it's extra important for a remote team to say, when we have disagreements, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to handle that. And even about, here's how we communicate. So the person who sent out the message to say there was a conflict, I don't know what their intent was in doing that, but that could be a good thing to say, you know what, there are disagreements. Let's step back. Let's figure out how we handle this, because the goal should be all of you wanting to drive that business forward, to have a good solution. I'm sure you weren't doing it just to be difficult. I'm sure you had a purpose to why you were disagreeing about something. And so that's what we're talking about, is having norms of, here's how we handle these types of things. So I put together some different things. So Howard, one of the areas you talked about when I asked about your goals for today were about meetings, how you make the best of them. And a lot of teams, even if they're not remote, have norms of, here's how we handle meetings. When you're doing a remote team, it's extra important to do that. Otherwise, they become a free-for-all. As I said, you know, 8 months ago, everybody was kind of on board and they were just happy to, you know, be able to connect and make it work. But now as we get into a place of, this is how we're doing things, it's important to make sure that there are actions coming out of it, that there's a byproduct of those meetings that's going to help drive you forward. And so these are some different areas, and you'll get the book from Fen after this that will have these notes in it, so don't worry about writing everything down that you'll see here. But some things you should think about when you're having a meeting. First of all, scheduling. What makes sense? How often to do it? If you have Dan, in your current situation, you probably don't have this, but with a bank, you might. Howard, I would assume you have a situation too, but being attentive to time zones. I was on a global team once at Lubrizol where we were doing this huge global project over about a year and a half. And we had people from the US, South America, Europe, Asia. And so all of our meetings were at 6 a.m. our time, which was tough enough. And we were coming into the office for that. But then we had people in Europe who had the meeting then from 11 to 1. And then you had people in Europe who were doing it in their evening. And so thinking in terms of time zones and what makes sense, and does it make sense? Do you have to have everybody on at once? Or is it always somebody's evening? Or does somebody always have to be in before the crack of dawn with meetings? So paying attention to those kind of things. Figuring out who attends the meeting and what's a quorum. I know sometimes I've been on meetings where there's 10 people who usually come to the meeting, and when one doesn't come, everyone says, well, let's just cancel it. But there could be a certain person who's required in a meeting, but it shouldn't, just because one isn't there, shouldn't be an excuse to cancel it. And also, if there should be 10 people and only 2 are there, what's your quorum? Does it make sense to continue having that meeting? One way to keep people really engaged, particularly in remote meetings, is to rotate the roles. So sometimes you have, sometimes you might have Nate schedule the meeting, and then Dan will do the facilitation, and then will be the scribe. And so it gives people different roles in the meeting, and it feels more, they're going to be more engaged when they have a particular role within a meeting. And so that can keep people more engaged. Having an agenda. Oftentimes we would have just a quick warm up, and it's especially important on a remote team. When you're in the room and you go around oh, what was your first pet or something? It's nice, but it doesn't really take you anywhere. But on a remote team, it's really helpful because you don't have those in-person connections to be able to continue building the relationship with the person. And so when you're in the room or when you're doing things remotely, it's nice to just have a quick, let's go around the room and do something to get to know each other a little bit. Using an EOS process, which is an entrepreneurial operating system. When I was at a company recently, we used the EOS process for meetings, which is you bring up issues, you discuss, and you solve. And you can put a time frame around it. And so I might bring up an issue that the way that we're processing claims isn't working. We need to add another layer to it, or we need to remove a layer to it. We would discuss it, and then we would say, what is the solve? The solve might be, we've discovered a solution in the room, or the solve might be, we need Howard to take this to someone else to do something. But it gives you a structure for how you handle things. How you're going to use technology, and being explicit about this, not just hoping everyone has their camera on, not just hoping that people participate, but saying, for this particular meeting, I'm just going to share information. If you want your cameras off, that's fine. This meeting, however, I do want participation. It's important to have your camera on. It's important to take notes. It's important to be engaged. And using different things around meeting etiquette. So we expect people to be on time and ready to go, minimizing background noise as you can. If people are at home, you can't always control that. Yesterday was garbage day and I was on the phone and it was really loud outside. I can't control that, but doing your best to do that. Now, I was on a lot of global teams at Lubrizol, and one thing that often happened is you'd have, you hearing that? Right by the microphone, right? People would be, so some of us might be having lunch in the meeting because of when it was scheduled, and people will be opening their lunch right by the microphone. And the people on the phone, that would be really loud. They couldn't hear. There'd be side conversations, and you just hear this mumbling, and you didn't know if they were talking to you. And so having agreements that you're going to be focused and you're going to do these kind of things. Again, when you're in the room, you can shoot someone the evil eye if they're doing something. You can kick them under the table. You can say something. But when you're in a remote meeting, these are things that if you're not doing them can really disengage people.
Hey, Molly.
Yeah.
Hey, just a quick question. Has there been any studies or information regarding the video portion of a remote meeting? Because I don't know, I was just thinking, sitting here thinking, and for the past year, we've never had a remote meeting where everybody had to be on the camera. So it's been camera off, kind of
Hmm.
meeting. So I can sense there's a lot of missed opportunities, to get that kind of personal effect with everybody. So maybe I could take this back to my next meeting and present that to my boss. If there's any information that will lead to like a better communication kind of gathering.
I don't have a specific number for you, Dan, but I made a note that I'll look and see if I can find something. I think
Okay.
logic kind of tells you, because if you're not looking, if you're not having to be on camera, what's going to happen? You're going to pick up your
Yeah.
phone. You're going to be looking at your phone. Oh,
Right.
there's an email. I'm going to check the email. You're going to be talking with someone else. Did you hear what Dan just said? Yeah, and you're typing at the person. But if you're on camera, you're less likely to do that. So I'll see if I can find some numbers or something for you, but I would think logic. Nate, do you have something?
I would tell you that, to talk about this with some of my friends, I've got a friend who's a computer programmer, and he regularly says that during his meetings, that's his time he does the dishes. So, and I don't think that makes him any less of a worker, but like the fact that he's gotten into such a rhythm that he dedicates that time to do his dishes while because he doesn't have to be on camera, no one knows any better, and now you're really giving it your full attention. I don't know. I think drawing on something that Molly, I think you said before of those breakout activities, if there is some way to incorporate the on video portion of it, like someone holding up something or having people like do things in their house or showing them off as part of a warm-up, might give like a fun reason for everyone to show their faces on camera. It'd be interesting to someone for them to try it on one time, will it stick? But I don't know. I think it's already difficult enough as it is for us to have this distance thing, and to turn your cameras off is one more layer of depersonalization.
I'll add to that too. If you have a meeting where people, and Nate, I won't say I'm above doing something like that because I've probably done that myself in different situations.
I think we've all done it, but I don't schedule it.
Yeah, but here's the point. If you have a meeting where you don't need people to participate, you don't need that engagement, you don't need people to give something back to you, why are you having that meeting? Okay, because you didn't really engage with the person because they're doing their dishes or only just sort of hearing you, or they're playing with their phone or whatever, or doing other work. And so why are you having that meeting? Would it make sense more to just send out a communication and say, do you have any questions? A meeting should be when people need to engage, share information, a two-way kind of thing. And this goes for when you're in the office too. If you've got a meeting where, I've been in meetings where people just bring in their laptops and they're in the room and they're just doing emails and things like that. So if it's not important enough for people to be engaged with it, then why are they there?
If I could add one more. Can I add one more thing to that? And I think this goes to technology. We've had a couple of conversations at Cleveland State about now that it's become so widespread using different platforms, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, et cetera. But there's also become different packages of within all those services. And I think it may be helpful to recognize that there may be a different technology that's appropriate to use rather than just defaulting to a Zoom. For example, there's like a webinar platform. And if you do have a lot of people, then it's more of a one-way communication. It may be more appropriate to go a webinar format, and that will automatically cut down on like the background noise and all that kind of stuff. But if it's meant to be more interpersonal, I guess, then yeah, a different platform may be more suitable.
Yeah, but it goes to like the participation. If, which is the next one, you may, if you want to get people more involved, you could rotate roles and have people facilitate. Thinking about consensus and how you invite participation for different people. Sometimes there's only one or two people on the phone and you forget about them. Even if you say, I was on a team recently and we had one person in another city, and I said, you know what, I'm going to make sure we include you. But I was in the room, and as soon as the dialogue started, we completely forgot the person on the phone until she cleared her throat. We're like, oh yeah, we got to include her as well. And so making sure that you're actually inviting dialogue. So as the facilitator, checking in with that person who is on the phone, or all of those on the phone, and not just saying, hey, does anyone have any questions? But Nate, I haven't heard from you in a while. What are your questions? Dan, what are your thoughts? Ben, do you have any input on this? Howard, anything before we move on? And then making sure you're taking notes, you have action items. If there are no action items on these meetings, there's nothing coming out of them. Going back to the point I made a few minutes ago, that maybe you don't need this meeting. If it's just because you want to bring people together once a week, then maybe just send that information that's just sort of a one-way kind of thing out a different way. You can record a Zoom, just like we're doing here. You could record yourself saying, hey, let me give you the update on what's going on with the business, blah, blah, blah. If you have questions, let me know. But then do something that's more connective with your team, and then bring them together and say, hey, I sent that out yesterday. What are your thoughts? And in doing something where you can have a little bit more fun with the team as well. It's also, whether you're online or not, important to make sure that those who didn't attend the team meeting gets notes, because otherwise you'll spend the next meeting updating them on 10 minutes on here's what we did last time. Anything else that you've all done in a remote team that's been effective? And that's why it's important to have, this is why we're having this meeting. This is what the expectation is in this meeting, so that people know. So if it is truly okay for someone to be doing their dishes or pushing their daughter on a swing, there might be some where you're just saying, hey, let me give you a quick update. That's fine. But others where you really do need people to buy in and get consensus, because this all goes to what we're going to be talking about today, which has to do with engagement and understanding how you get your team involved in the work that they're doing. And so there's other things that you need to know about your team. So you just brought up one, Howard, like the levels of trust and power. When you have that senior person in the meeting, yeah, everyone's going to show up. Everyone's going to be looking at the camera and being engaged. They're going to answer the questions. Their microphone is going to be on. Their camera is going to be on. Different cultural preferences, and thinking about how that can impact, especially if you're talking with someone for the first time. You may be thinking, we have a half hour, I'm just going to run through this Zoom call real quick, and you jump on and you're talking with someone new that you don't have a relationship with. Different cultures look at starting off a meeting cold like that very negatively, and are going to want to build that relationship. It's going to be very important to your ability to have a conversation with them, to sell product to them, to sell services to them, to have a trusting relationship with them, if you take the time to build that connection. Different people have different technology at home. So you may have provided technology for people, or they might be using their own laptop, and they may have their own wireless issues and things. And so they may have access to different quality of technology, which can impact things. And then finally, introverts and extroverts. So I'm curious, how would you all label yourselves? Who's an introvert? Who's an extrovert? Who's an introvert, do you think, of yourselves? Okay, so Dan, were you guys? Okay, Nate?
Just barely, but I'm slightly introvert.
I think I was more the introvert spectrum, but I'm definitely headed the opposite direction. The past few years, I've been in a lot of meetings. I was a board member for a nonprofit, and so I really don't have a choice to be an introvert.
Okay. So the rest.
Howard's on the phone, but I can testify that Howard's an extreme introvert, by the way.
Oh,
he is
really?
far on the introvert spectrum. He's the definition of an introvert.
No, okay, I was thinking, no, I didn't think so, but all right. Well, I'm an extrovert myself too. So it's hard for me sometimes to be quiet, and I can end up dominating a conversation, and you just assume that introvert agrees with everything because they're not saying anything. And whether you're in a room or not with a person, introverts need time to reflect. They need time to process. They're not going to be good at brainstorming. You add a camera and a microphone, and everybody's staring at your picture in your room and, judging the background of what you got behind you. On top of that, introverts aren't going to be as participative in a meeting. So what do you think, if you're leading a team, what are some things you could do to make sure that you get that balance so you don't have the Mollies and the Howards dominating the conversations? Any thoughts?
I think just, you know, calling people like you mentioned before, you know, hey Susie, I haven't heard from you for a while. You know, what are your thoughts on this procedure? Or just kind of force the hand.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one good thing to do. Yeah. Another thing that's, oops, that's weird. Another thing that's helpful is also giving, when possible, letting people know what's going to be discussed in the meeting. And so if we're going to be talking about plans for next year, I won't just say like, hey, let's start discussing, go, because the introverts need to think about it. They want to reflect on it. Because what happens if you don't do that, you'll walk out of the meeting or you'll close down after the meeting and they'll contact you later and say, I know we agreed on this, but I just had a great idea. And so if you can let them know tomorrow morning's meeting, the focus is going to be this. I'm hoping that we can do some brainstorming on this topic. That'll allow them to also prepare. Also, sometimes too, you can joke with your extroverts and say, you know what, Mollie, we've heard a lot of really great things from you. How about we give someone else a chance, or, you know, maybe even talking with the Mollies beforehand and say, you know, let's make sure that we get others involved in the conversation as well. Okay. So when you think about motivation on a team, there's a couple, when you think about it, this is how it kind of works. People need to be motivated. When we talk about motivation, it's a willingness to get the job done. It's about not procrastinating. It's jumping in to a project and working on it, investing the mental effort that it takes to succeed. And motivation really accounts for about 40% of a successful project. It isn't just, you know, I've got the skills to do it. Motivation has to be there as well. When someone's motivated, they're going to be more engaged. They're going to take ownership. That's going to help their performance, and you're going to get results. It's interesting. I was, we're going to talk about motivation now and getting your team motivated. And yesterday I was coaching someone who works for a local company. I don't want to say the name, but it's one that you think of having a very youthful, energetic culture, very playful culture, very successful company. And he does some, he's a developer at this company. And I was talking with him about how the culture has been different since he's working at home. And although he enjoys a lot of those aspects, he said, you know, I've really lost a lot of this essence of what made this company what it was. And I don't even know if I still want to be part of that, because it's losing some of the feel for why I joined that organization in the first place. And so understanding from a person what motivates them, what's important to them, what gets them excited about doing their work is really important. And when you're on a remote team, there's a lot of things that can impact motivation, and some of them for the good and some of them not for the good. What do you think are some of the things that can impact a team's motivation when they're working remotely?
I know for where I work, two motivations are monetary, because you can get, you know, extra bonus, and also company recognition, where they'll send out kudos, you know, for certain individuals or milestones or whatever, you know, just to let the company know that this person has kind of set the standard a little higher or achieved something great.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, because you're not in the room. It's not like someone's going to say, hey, let's give Dan applause, you know, when you're in the break room together in your conference room or something. You're in a different location. So it's extra important on a remote team.
Yeah, I think that's
well, I put together.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, then. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think that's kind of like, that's what I like about our team here at Cleveland State. On our weekly team meetings, everyone kind of get a chance to go around and talk about what they're working on, and, you know, their recent successes, and we get a chance to congratulate them and recognize them for what they do. So that feels pretty good to still, in a way, stay connected and recognize people for what they've done.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, are some of the key things that really do keep people motivated. So, and a lot of it has to do with just what you said, that working together and then people noticing it having an impact. And that's something we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. So remote teams are dealing with a lot of the same things you deal with when you're in the office, like thinking about your career, your pay, your development opportunities. But there's a lot of things that also are layered on top of that, that on a remote team are bigger factors or additional factors in motivation. Visibility. You can't grow your career if nobody knows what you're doing. And then you said, you go around and talk about what people did. And Dan, you said, you give recognition. That's awesome, because it's even harder when you're working remotely. Your boss says thanks, and then your work goes on somewhere else. You don't know if someone likes it or doesn't like it, because you don't have that in-person connection to maybe get some immediate feedback. Obviously, and we're not going to delve into this, but there's tons of issues right now, both positive and negative, having to do that family and life issues, that balance, having boundaries about when do I work, when don't I work. I kind of like being able to do some stuff at home in the evening and just kind of work when I want to, versus working on a schedule. But for some people, that's hard, because, for a while when we were all working at home together here, my computer was on the dining table. I'd hear a ding and I go, oops, email, and I go over and check it right away, versus if it's up here in my office, I would just close it and not worry about it. We talked about culture and how that can be a challenge. Language issues. If you have people on the phone who English isn't their first language, especially it's going to be tough in a remote environment, because they're translating what you're saying into their language, thinking about what they want to say, and then translating it back. And so if you're on a remote team, oftentimes you don't give people the breath to kind of do that, or they might not have the confidence to feel comfortable doing that. Time zones we talked about. When you work remotely, you don't have access to the same people, the same data, the same opportunities. You don't have that help desk down the road or down the hall that you can ask. My daughter just started a new job, and she's having a real challenge getting a hold of the technology people to help, where when she was in a building at this one point, she could just go down the hall and say, hey, can somebody help me? But now she's got to be on the phone constantly trying to get a hold of people and being put on hold. So disconnection can sometimes happen as well. So how that plays into motivation, I'm going to show you some numbers here. Interestingly, and this isn't just remote office, but some studies from Gallup show that globally, employees who aren't, there's about 85% of employees who say they're really not engaged or they're disengaged from work when they're working remotely. However, there's a higher probability of organizations being higher profitability of organizations who have employees who are engaged. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? But here's the thing, as a leader, you have a key role in making sure that your employees are engaged. So I'm going to talk about a couple ways that happens. First of all, one of the questions is, and we talked about this early on, I think in the first session, Dan, I think you were in the second, so you probably weren't there. I asked, what's it like to be on a remote team? Do you like it? What are the pros and cons and that sort of thing? So you'll be interested to know that when people have a choice, so you can come into the office or not, and not because of a pandemic, but just this is the structure of our company and you have a choice. What that looks like when people are able to have a choice of where they work, motivation, not great news, is still only at about 40% when people have a choice whether or not coming into the office or whether they're working remotely. When they have no choice, there's still less motivation if you're working remotely, but look at the level. So if you've got people right now who have to work at home, it's no choice, you will work at home. You see that level of engagement is significantly lower. And so where it comes into is choice. Now, right now, we don't have choice in most cases, whether it's something mandated by the state or it's something your organization has decided. Oftentimes, people right now are in a situation where they don't have a choice. So it's important to think in terms as a leader. You might not be able to control that, but what can you control? So thinking about where you can give your team choices in how they do their job. So what do you think? What are some of the choices you can give your team in how they perform their job that you do have flexibility with? I'm curious of what your thoughts are.
I'd say as much as possible to allow them to choose the hours of the day that they would work, or to manage their own schedule to the best that's allowable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Different people, some people wake up and they are just ready to go. They would love to just be online at 4 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever, and just boom, hit the ground running, get it done. Others, no matter what time they go to bed, are just not really in a good place until noon. And they would just love to work into the evening. And so when you have to be in the office at a certain time, that can be a real challenge because you have to maybe perform when you're physically, emotionally, mentally not at that best capacity. And sometimes you do have to have that overlap. Sometimes jobs don't allow for that flexibility, but where you can, that's a great way to give people choice. So I'm going to go through a couple of things quickly here around motivation. Key concepts about motivation that are really important is, first of all, thinking in terms of individual. So thinking about what each person needs, what's going to be important to them, whether it's flexibility, when they work, how they work, that's going to help the person feel connected with the team. Making sure that when you do communicate with people, that it isn't always just one way, that it isn't always just, okay, everybody mute your mics, I'm going to communicate to you, or I'm going to send an email and it's going to be one way. But making sure that you have the door open, that people can share information back. It's also, and we've talked about this quite a bit around trust and conflict, but about being transparent. Because one thing you've probably noticed, whatever side of the coin you're on in a communication, is when you're not transparent, when you're not explicit about what's happening, people are going to fill in the blanks. And it's usually not with correct information, because when there's a vacuum of information, it needs to get filled and people will fill it. So as much as you can to be transparent. Providing autonomy is very important, but holding people accountable for it. So giving the flexibility about how a person does their job and when they do their job, but I still expect you to do the job, and I expect you to communicate with me, and I expect you to do it effectively. Holding yourself accountable and holding the team accountable. Now, Gallup has done some studies over time, and they found they do a lot of engagement surveys. What's becoming less important in motivation are things just like a paycheck. And I don't mean it in the sense of just getting paid. Getting paid is obviously important, and it's why we all work, right? But just doing it for the paycheck is becoming less important. Doing it just thinking about, what I get out of things and my annual review, being told what I'm not doing right, and focusing on just the job now. What's becoming more important is people focusing on kind of the what's next, how things fit into the bigger picture. So their purpose, how does their work contribute to the success of the organization? Will I be developed? Do I have a coach who can help me be more successful? Having ongoing conversations, which is something that we'll talk about quite a bit tomorrow in performance management, in having ongoing conversation, focusing on your strengths, and then thinking holistically. If there's nothing this year hasn't taught us, it's thinking about our life holistically, what's important to us all around. Also, as a leader, it's important to be able to communicate about your team and what's important. I shared this model in the first session, kind of as a team operating model, especially if you have new members to your team, or if this has changed at all over the past year or as your business evolves, making sure people are very clear and they understand the work they do, how their individual work contributes to the overall success of the organization. For some people, it's clear. I make a product, I sell a product, got it. But when you work in HR, when you work on the grounds crew, when you are somebody who maybe just delivers mail within the organization, when you're in an admin role, when you're in finance, how do those roles contribute to the success? Understanding the purpose of your organization. There are countless studies that show that that's becoming very important, particularly for workers just entering the organization. I told you about the person I was coaching yesterday. Aligning what's important to me to what's important to this organization and what it stands for is very important. And then also the how we do things. You know, it goes to the norms we talked about, as well as what our processes are. What are people's roles and accountabilities? And we'll talk about accountabilities a little more in detail in just a moment. And understanding how all of those things and how my work and my value contribute to the results. Now, some other things, I told you before that motivation isn't particularly high. You know, when you think about it, you know, people just jumping in and being really excited about what they do. But there are some other things that really impact motivation. So if you look at this, the blue lines represent when somebody does not have a choice of whether they're working at home or not. And the red line indicating, or the pink, somebody who does have a choice. If they're not allowed to experiment or solve meaningful problems, over time, this is really going to be demotivated. So not only are they not representing a little bit of motivation, they're going to be exhibiting significant demotivation. When they are allowed to solve meaningful problems, look how much it takes, or look how much it grows in their motivation and allowing them to feel more excited and engaged with what they're doing. And so this, I think, Fen, when you were talking about some of the things you're doing, I think it kind of falls into what I'm going to talk about here, what you as a leader can be thinking about with your teams and how you get them excited and how you get them involved in their work. There's 3 elements that Gallup identified. The first is play. And what that means is allowing people to connect with each other, encouraging them to do that. So even like a lot of times leaders think about, I will bring the team together and we will have a little coffee and update meeting and we'll talk about things, but encourage them to do it with each other too. So you don't even have to be there, but letting them know it's okay to take 10, 15 minutes in a given day to connect with each other, allowing them to be part of each other's lives. Nate mentioned something I brought up in the first session is giving people different opportunities at a meeting. So 10 minutes every meeting, you take your computer, one person takes their computer around the house and says, you know, this is my kitchen. I just remodeled it. What do you think? Or let me show you, I like to cook pasta. Let me give you a quick demo on that. Or, you know, this is my backyard and this is where I like to hang out with the family. We have a new fire pit. Let me show you. Or introducing people into different parts of their lives, their pets and children and things like that. Allowing people to make decisions together. And I love the word that Gallup had there is the joy of problem solving. How exciting it is to solve a problem together. And so encouraging your team to work together to solve meaningful problems is really exciting for them. So they give each other that virtual high five. It's a real adrenaline rush to let people do that. Again, and I've been stressing this, but that having a purpose, knowing that your work contributes to something. No one likes to just make the donuts, or to be the cog in the machine. They want to know their work matters. It matters to the big picture. It matters to the boss. It matters to the team. It matters in some way that's meaningful. And then finally, it's very important when you have remote workers to make sure that they have visibility. When is it possible to let your team do the presentation to senior leaders versus just you? How can you make sure that they have development opportunities that are going to allow them to get visibility, that's going to allow them to grow their career, that they get the training that they need, the coaching that they need, and making sure that they have access to what they need to do their jobs effectively. Now, in building the team and giving them opportunities to do some of these things together, you can build it into the structure of how you interact with your team. So for example, on Monday, when you're launching the week, do it in the right way. And you could do this in a meeting, you could do this email, you can text people, whatever makes sense. But just start the week just by saying to people, you know, what are you excited about? What are you concerned about? What are the problems we're trying to solve this week? How can we help each other? You know, Nate, you're working on this project. Wow, that sounds great. Dan, you said you had kind of a quiet week. Any chance you'd be able to jump in and help Nate with this? Great. Why don't you two connect and do this? But getting that week off kind of on an energetic start, and, you know, we're all in this together, and what are we working on and how can we accomplish it? During the week, encourage the team to have those one-on-ones together, to video conference, checking in with them, but not making it sound like you're checking up. So then I asked you to work on that data for me. How is it? Where is it? Instead of doing it that way, to, you know, hey, what's going well? Anything you need from me? Any roadblocks you want me to remove from you? So she still feels ownership, but she knows I haven't just left her out there. And then finally, at the end of the week, doing that reflection and that measurement. How did it go? Does anybody, you know, what went well? What's ahead next week? What do we need to carry forward? Is there anything you have that you could share with the team that you learned from this week that we can carry it forward? All of these simple things. And if you're, one of the words I often use when I'm doing team development, leadership development, is being very, very intentional and very purposeful. So intentional meaning you're doing it in a very deliberate kind of way, and purposeful that there's a meaning in it. And so scheduling it, that every Monday you do this, every Thursday you do that, every Friday you check in and you build it as part of your meetings. It can be something that can be incredibly motivating for your team. When you're on a remote team and you're encouraging your team to collaborate, some things you can do is give them real problems to solve. So it's not just, hey, I want you guys to connect during the week, but think about things that don't usually get solved. You know, they kind of get put on the back burner, you know, those future projects, the rainy day projects kind of thing. You can give those to your team and ask them to kind of noodle around with them. Whether it's something strategic, you know, blue sky, what will our world look like next year? What might some of the big issues be next year that we have to think about? Or it could be something really simple. How do we make more effective meetings? How do we create some norms for our team? There's lots of technology and tools that can help with that. And one thing I encourage too, when people are brainstorming, whether it's in the room or virtual, is to use a technique similar to what people have used in improv. What is the one word you should never say when you're doing improv? Does anybody know? The word is no, because it shuts down the, what was that? You should never say no, because it shuts down the conversation when you're doing improv. Same thing as when you're brainstorming. And so encourage people to think in terms of yes, if. We could make it work if we did this. And so giving people that opportunity to play and so forth. Also, here's a manager's motivation checklist that I found from Huffington Post. And I think these work especially well on a remote team because it comes to that intentionality. This will also be in the workbook that then we'll send out to you. And think about, you know, where could you be doing some things different with your team? Just like when we talked about trust last time, motivation is also behavioral. It's not just this ethereal, magical thing that happens. It happens because you as a leader are creating an environment, because you're working with your employee to create an environment where they're going to be able to succeed and do their best and feel the most connected. And there are specific things you can do. So I suggest what you do is think about your team. Think about how you would rate their motivation, and think about what you've done intentionally and purposefully to help lead in that motivation. I know I'm talking a little bit quick, but I'm looking at the content we have left to cover and the time. So I'll ask, are there any questions before we move on to decisions? Okay. So last time we talked about with conflict a little bit, and I'm just going to share this one slide from last time, is oftentimes where conflict comes into play is people are focused, they dig their heels, and Howard, I won't ask you to, you know, expose your situation and say whether this happened in yours, but they hold really tightly to a position. They say, I'm in the right, I have the facts, and you think the other person is looking at things the same way. When you're thinking about decisions you need to make as a team, and having something where you get the buy-in so we can move forward, so you're not going back to the team and constantly saying, how do we revisit this, and how do we, do I really have the buy-in, is finding a way that there's a compatible interest, something that will work for both. We're not going to go into this in detail, but I want you to be thinking in terms of this as we go forward. So I'm curious, for those of you on remote teams, what are some of the kinds of decisions you need to make on a remote team, and what are, real quickly, what are some of the difficulties with doing it on a remote team? Making decisions on a remote team. And I'm using the word agile here, and I don't mean it in the sense of like lean decision making, agile with a capital A, even though I have it capitalized here. When you're working on a remote team, you need to make decisions in a very specific way. You should, like anything, you should have a process for that. So Howard, without deep diving that, thinking through who do I have to include? How do I have to include them? You want to have a repeatable process for decisions. You want them to be collaborative when it makes sense, and including different perspectives. Doesn't mean you don't own the decision, but how you include others. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. Decisions today, you need to be adaptive. Like I talked about with the meeting, do you really need to have everybody in the meeting? I'll show you a tool where you can sort of think through, who do I need to have as part of this decision? And being flexible in how you make decisions, because our world today is causing us to be and act very differently. And then the transparency, where I think some of that could come in, is sharing perhaps why we had to make this decision this way. Let me help you understand the broader context of what we're doing here and why the decision had to go in this direction. When you're making decisions on a remote team, you need to be flexible, you need to be thinking innovatively, and you have to do it quickly. I'm going to walk you through very quickly a model. This will be in the notes that you get in the workbook. And then I'm going to talk particularly about stakeholders, which could be helpful, Howard. Thinking about stakeholders, what's important to them. It'll be different things to each of them. What are the impacts on the stakeholders, both within and outside of the team? It's the first step, is to just have that thought. And I'll talk a little bit about in a couple minutes about how you can involve them. Making assumptions, what's going to be important to them? What's going to be the impact of this? Doing some scenario planning about what might happen if you do things a certain way. And understanding who needs to have a voice. So we'll talk in a minute about that, like who do you inform versus who do you consult? But who needs to have a voice in this decision versus who do I just need to communicate with and keep up to date? Doing an analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data. Now, Dan, you asked me for some data because you wanted to have a conversation with your team about remote working. That's a good thing, is to have that data. It doesn't have to be quantitative. There aren't always numbers for everything. Sometimes qualitative data, having stories, having other things that you can share. That output of healthy conflict conversations that you've had with people, making connections amongst things, thinking in terms, and this is incredibly more so true today than it's ever been, but not just in terms of what solves this problem, but what's going to put us in a better position to be able to be ready for tomorrow. Thinking about different possibilities, trying to think out of the box. Scenario planning. Nobody could have predicted everything that happened this year, but thinking in terms of what ifs. What if this? Here's what we'll do. What if that? Here's what we'll do. And creating decisions that have the flexibility to address multiple scenarios. And then also, again, revisiting your stakeholders. And then finally, taking action. Sometimes people are so excited they made a decision. They say, decision's done. But haven't really gone into talking with the people that need to be informed and making sure you do that buy-in. Now, we're not going to go into change management here, Howard, but understanding how to engage with others in the right part in the process so that you can bring them along versus having to pull them along later. How can you involve them in that? And making sure your employees are involved so that you can do that play, purpose, and potential. So when you're making decisions, one thing, Patrick Lencioni, who I refer to quite a bit in this program, he talks about in his videos about when he talks about conflict, when he talks about decision making, he says when people have a chance to weigh in, they're going to be more they're going to demonstrate more buy-in. Doesn't mean you have to go with it. It doesn't mean that if I ask Dan what his thoughts are and it's different than what I was planning to do, it doesn't necessarily mean I have to do that. What it does mean is if I say, wow, Dan, you know, I really like what you have to say. Here's a piece I can incorporate, or I'm going to keep that in mind. And I appreciate your concern. I still think we need to move in this direction. You're going to get more buy-in than if you just say, I'm not even going to talk with them because I know they're on a different page or I know what they're thinking already. Don't wait till you have consensus. I was on a team at Lubrizol that started off with about 4 or 5 people that really, I was leading this team, a global team, that for a project that should have just been this 4 or 5 experts on this topic. But France wanted to have somebody involved, and then somebody in another country wanted to have somebody involved, somebody in another perspective. We ended up with about 30 people. And trying to get buy-in from 30 people was just ridiculous. So getting consensus didn't make sense in that situation, but it kind of, there was a scope creep kind of thing. And it happened without my even being fully cognizant of what I was getting myself into. So thinking about having the right people in that decision-making process and talking with them, just like with the meeting. If the meeting is so unimportant that I have time to do dishes and play video games on my phone while I'm listening, I don't need to be there. And there's probably a better use of my time and a better way of communicating with me. Disagree and then commit. In the room, have the conversation, hash it out. What are your opinions? What are my opinions? Okay, let's all get it together. I own the decision. I've weighed everything that the right people have said, and here's how we're going to go forward. Let's walk out of the room, the virtual room, and commit. Avoiding groupthink is really important. That often happens when, you know, Howard, you mentioned when you have that really senior person in the room and everyone feels like they have to go with what that person thinks. And they bring up an idea and all of a sudden our great conversation becomes, well, Joe said, and oh yeah, well, if Joe wants it, I guess we better. So thinking about who you have in that conversation. Failing fast and learning fast. So every decision you make is not going to be perfect, and not holding onto it with, you know, like until you rip it out of my hand, you know, my cold dead fingers, but being able to say, you know what, this isn't going to be the way to go. Let's learn from it. Let's move on and be willing to go differently. And then recognizing how much the world is changing. Has anyone ever heard of the term VUCA? VUCA. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's a term that explains how the world is just changing. These are exponential ways that the world of work and just the world is changing. And we have to make decisions using a different model than we did in the past. So as a leader, it's expected that you're able to make good decisions that are going to work in that environment. So I told you there's a model. You've probably seen this. You can also Google it. We use this a lot at Lubrizol. We use it with decisions. We used it with accountability. It's called a RACI. And what it is it defines when you're making a decision or you're putting together a project plan, how you assign different tiers of roles or involvement in something. So when you're making a decision, you as the leader might assign somebody to do some of that work for you. They might be doing the research. They might be completing the task, but that's the person responsible for doing a task. It can be shared amongst people. They're probably a subject matter expert, and they're probably capable of maybe solving the problem. So it could have been, Howard, you might have gathered data from different people in making your decision, but ultimately you're accountable for it. And I always thought that the A should come before the R in this example, but accountable is the person ultimately answerable. It is the person with whom the buck stops. It stops here. I am the one who owns this. And this is the person who sets the scope for the decision, who sets the boundaries. It can't be shared with other people. It is mine. And here's where people oftentimes get tripped up, is between consult and inform. There's probably, as you're making a decision, a couple people that you might want to check in with. You might want to get their buy-in. These are the key stakeholders that are really going to be impacted by the decision or by the project or whatever it is you're doing. They probably have some expertise. You want to get their thoughts. You want to get their opinion. You want to let them know where you're going and make sure that what you're doing isn't going to have a huge impact on them. And their value is they have a really vested interest in the outcome. They're going to be impacted by it. So if you can bring them in as you're going, again, you still own the decision. You're still accountable. But you're bringing them in to say, what are your thoughts on this? What is your input on this? Here's where I'm going. I'm going to take how this impacts you into account as I make my decision. And then finally, the inform piece is, who do you let know either while you're making the decision or afterwards? Here's what happened. And there could be a large group of people. So you made your decision and you may say, okay, here's people, what I need you to do about that. They may be just notified after the fact or at some point during the process. There could be different tiers. Your boss, you might just say, here's where we're going, here's how it's working. But other people afterwards, you might just say, we moved the parking lots. They're now over here instead of over there. And again, I have a copy, I have this diagram as well as a blank RACI sheet that you can use when you have to make decisions or when you're managing a project. This can be an excellent tool. I can't tell you how many times I've used this in decisions and particularly on a remote team. So how do you engage stakeholders in remote decision making? I have a couple do's and don'ts here. First of all, understand their objectives, engage them as early as possible in the process, continually communicate. One thing I keep saying is when you're on a remote team, you cannot over communicate. Let them know what's happening. Here's who I'm talking to. Here's different ways. You can bring them together once a week and give an update. You could do a newsletter once a week. You could do a little video update of here's what's going on. Giving them context. We made this decision. Let me help you understand some of the variables I had to consider in doing this. Use data and technology as your friend and look for those mutually beneficial outcomes. On a remote team in particular, see if you can find some remote champions. So if you have people in different physical locations, maybe it's a remote team, not because people are working at home, but they're in different buildings in different places or different regions. Find some remote champions who do believe in what you're doing, who are more acquainted with or more connected with some of the people who might be roadblocks. Some don'ts. Don't dismiss concerns or assume that because you haven't heard any bad news that people agree. So I sent out my email and I said, hey, here's where we're doing, here's the new plan. Crickets. Oh, everybody must be on board. Think of all the various reasons why I didn't hear anything. Got caught in their spam folder. They read it and they were furious. They didn't even see it in their email. They're all complaining with each other. They're going to my boss to complain about me. So there could be all sorts of reasons I don't hear anything, but it doesn't necessarily mean agreement. Be clear and consistent in your messages. Don't just think about how you like to get communicated with. A lot of the leaders I coach, I often hear from them say things, well, I would have liked this. That's nice for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to be best for everyone. And don't shortchange the fact that you're going to have a change process involved in this. And thinking in terms of not just I got it out there and people aren't kicking and screaming, it means they're on board. So when you want to make high velocity decisions on a remote team, some things to think about, get people with some different perspectives. Even assign someone as a devil's advocate. I've done that before. Poke holes in my argument. Tell me some of the things people are going to shoot down. Where are the flaws in what I'm trying to say? Recognize there's no one size fits all. In a VUCA world, you're not going to have all the information you need. Recognize where you have misalignment, deal with it early, and act with confidence in uncertainty.